I'm so glad to be joined again today on Bad Faith Podcast by Dr. Annelle Sheline. You know her as a woman who courageously resigned from the State Department back in the spring of 2024. She is now a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. Welcome back to Bad Faith Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it's a particularly opportune time for you to be joining me because a lot of folks are sort of gnashing their teeth, very frustrated over some recent comments from Samantha Power, who very famously did not show the courage that you showed and declined to resign from her position during the Biden administration as the head of USAID, despite the fact that she has a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about genocide, and yet declined during Biden's tenure and his execution of the Gaza genocide to say or do anything about it. I know that you reacted to her remarks on the internet. Before we get into that, let's give people just a little bit of a sense of what she actually said. Okay. All right. So the context of this is she was giving remarks at Notre Dame earlier this week. A student very savvily asked, in your book, A Problem from Hell, you criticized U.S.'s passivity in watching genocide unfold. You also recognize the power of using the word genocide, the G word, and recognizing genocide. Yet, as you yourself held a position of power in government, you failed to call out the genocide in Gaza, referring to it more as a humanitarian crisis. Given the importance of recognizing genocide and acting on genocide, I'm wondering why you did not name the genocide in Gaza when you were in a position of power, and if you continue to hold that. Here's what she said. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Gaza was the most difficult humanitarian crisis I worked in, certainly at USAID and probably my whole career. My job was to get food and medicine to the people who were living in Gaza, who were not getting access to clean water, to electricity, to adequate medicine, and of course, were suffering in many cases from acute malnutrition. While I know that there's an impulse on the outside for any official, especially a senior official who has the privilege that I had to make my own foreign policy, that's not what happens when you go into government. I don't just get up and decide today what U.S. foreign policy is. I certainly, as someone who wasn't then and I'm not now, looking at evidence as a lawyer, and I'm trying to get food from point A to point B with my men. And above all, I'm supporting my teams who are doing God's work 24/7 to do that. And by failing, by the way, a lot of the time because of the obstruction by the Israeli government. But when you are in government, that is the price of being in government. She goes on to say again that the price of being a part of the team that can do great work, an administration that can do great work, is that you're going to be part of what the president ultimately decides the policies and positions are. She says, my view was that I had the greatest job in the world to do as much good as I could in the fleeting time that I had in that position. Now, Dr. Sheline, you obviously behaved very differently in that position, and arguably with less power and insulation than someone like Samantha Power had. How did you respond to those remarks?
I I found those to be, well, first of all, just to salute the student for bringing this up. And I think when people ask me about my feelings about others who chose not to resign, I understand for someone who they're they're just doing their job in government. They don't have an alternative set of options. But for these people at the top, someone like Samantha Power, who for her to have resigned, you wouldn't have even needed to use the word genocide. It would have been so clear. If Samantha Power is resigning, it doesn't matter what they call it. Clearly, it's a genocide. She's Lady Genocide. She kind of built her whole career on calling out the need to the idea of like responsibility to protect, that the U.S. should have intervened in previous genocides. And so I am so frustrated with the Biden administration officials who had that sort of name recognition, who their resignation would have done so much. Instead, it was people like Josh Paul, like Hala Rarit, the Arabic language spokesperson, myself, others who resigned, who, while our resignation, I think, sent a message, it was easy for the administration to kind of say, well, if we still have someone like Samantha Power on board, how bad could it really be? Another thing that makes me so infuriated by sort of the smugness of her response is this idea that she was kind of more effective where she was than if she had resigned. Because when you look at what was actually happening on the ground, Gaza had the fastest rate of starvation ever recorded. And so any fiction she's telling herself about, like she's better at coordinating the response, and it's like, no, you're not. There are plenty of other people who coordinate humanitarian responses. Like you being in that position didn't do anything other than signal to the world and the American people that this was still acceptable. In particular, I think about the fact that in January of 2024, the Biden administration cut assistance, all money to UNRWA, the UN Refugee Works agency that sends money to Palestinian refugees. UNRWA is the biggest operation on the ground in Gaza. It's still operating in Gaza, in part because they still have so many employees. These are teachers and medical workers that UNRWA is still paying their salaries. And so by cutting that money, the US was the biggest source of support for UNRWA because we're the biggest economy in the world and we give the most to the UN, or at least we used to. The fact that wasn't a red line for her, because the evidence provided this idea that UNRWA, there were allegations of a handful of employees that were involved in October 7th. I saw that intelligence. It was not convincing. So the Biden administration cut assistance to the main agency operating assistance, getting help to people on the ground in Gaza in the midst of it was clear Israel was already committing genocide at that point. And I think it just speaks to the fact that anyone in a position of power, and in particular someone like Samantha Power, by insisting that they were doing more good by staying in their position, it's just evidence that they're addicted to the power, that they're addicted to the position, to having the ear of the president, being in these cush positions. And she is someone who, if she had resigned, she would have landed somewhere fancy. You think of all of all these Biden administration officials, all of whom have landed in very nice, cushy, whether it's at a high-powered consulting firm or a law firm or Harvard, these various academic institutions, like all these people were going to be fine, no matter what. Yeah. And so I think it's super important that people don't forget about how the Biden administration enabled so much of what we later saw in Gaza under Trump, where things did get worse, but things were already so bad under Biden, and we shouldn't let these Biden officials try to launder their reputations and pretend like things weren't as bad under Biden, because they were.
Yeah, I wish we had audio of that exchange, because I would have liked to have known what sort of the atmosphere in the room was, and if there were any follow-up questions, maybe that will kind of trickle out over time. But it is, I take your point that these people would land on their feet, but I would almost say, I think they're right. I think they're right to anticipate that there are sinecures and opportunities that they would miss out on if they did oppose the Biden administration. I think the sick reality of it is that you do pay a cost. But what's frustrating is that the people who are seemingly best positioned to endure that cost, and simultaneously who would have the greatest impact because of what a high profile they have in the administration and just in the American political sphere, and who are like household names like Samantha Power, would simultaneously make a bigger impact and be able to better land on their feet. And repeatedly in these situations, when you look at who sort of paid the price in the Biden administration, who paid the price in the media sphere, who's paid the price personally in other kinds of jobs, it seems over and over again to be this middle tier and lower tier of people who are paying the most, and maybe also have the less to gain by kissing the ring. But it's deeply frustrating to watch this kind of culture of, well, you got to do what you got to do, and you got to keep your head down, and the economy is hard, and people got to bear through it. Yeah, like on some level, I understand that to be true. And it's difficult on a one-on-one basis to say, oh, you should have made the sacrifice because I made the sacrifice or someone else made the sacrifice. But when you do see a pattern emerge of the folks who could take the hit being the ones who are not doing so, I have no problem calling out someone like Samantha Power for choosing to put herself first. And then even after the fact, to continue to double down on this idea that she was doing the Lord's work in,
Right.
to your point, trying to get food to Gazans when she was in an administration who very purposefully and under the flimsiest of evidence cut all aid to the one humanitarian organization that was keeping Gaza afloat for the prior 75 years as they lived under apartheid conditions.
Exactly. Exactly. And, I think you hear about these, it also kind of feels like ancient history, but like in the Biden administration, the fact that people were unwilling to push against him, he was so old. He was such a senior, at this, he'd seen everything. He'd been in foreign policy for so long, like nobody could really tell him what was what on foreign policy. And like, we're seeing that to an even greater degree now with Trump, where like no one told him that going into Iran was the stupidest idea. Like, this is why Netanyahu has been pushing for this for 40 years. And no previous American president was stupid enough to take him up on it. And now here we are. Trump has opened this Pandora's box of the most foolish, I think, foreign policy decision and one of the most consequential events that has happened in the Middle East in decades. And beyond the Middle East, I mean, you think about like the impact on the global economy. You think about like fertilizer can't get through, and this. We were just saying it's early spring here in Washington. Like, farmers need fertilizer to plant crops. We could be looking at food shortages later in the year because people aren't able to plant crops, to like feed humanity. So again, this point about like the idea that like Trump is so bad and Biden was better. It's like, no, Trump is just sort of a more extreme version of so many of these pathologies that were completely there during the Biden administration. And now we're just sort of taken to this nth degree, this sort of like satirical level under Trump.
Well, to that end, I think in the last episode, maybe the one before, I played a clip of Hillary Clinton in the 2008 cycle, cheering on the prospect of a war with Iran. More recently, she gave an interview where she seemingly was complimentary of Trump's second term in office, which is not a position that most people tend to take. Let's take a quick listen to that clip.
I think all of that is a very good signal that there is beginning to be a better understanding, both by the president and the people around him, as well as by the leaders of our European allies, that there can be common ground amongst us. And the kind of dismissiveness that we saw in the first Trump administration has been replaced by a much more obvious working relationship to the good of European security, transatlantic security, and hopefully Ukrainian security. So I'm actually encouraged.
So I see the look on your face. What's your reaction off the cuff?
Oh my God. I mean, first of all, just why is anyone listening to her? Like, why? Oh my God.
Why are they letting her out of the pen?
Yeah. Right? Like, why is anyone still listening to either of the Clintons? But I mean, in particular, her point about like the European, I mean, with going after Greenland, Trump effectively fractured NATO. Like, the Europeans have woken up to the fact that their dependence on the United States for their security was never a good idea, and certainly not a good idea when you have a U.S. administration and a U.S. president who just doesn't care about anything other than his own personal interests. And I mean, you saw that in like the Carney speech that everybody talked about at Davos, and then like immediately Carney turns around and is, Canada is supporting this stupid war in Iran. But in general, the Europe, I mean, so if you're someone who's really motivated around Ukrainian security, the U.S. war on Iran is a terrible idea because like we are taking like interceptors or armaments or support that might have otherwise gone to Ukraine, although that's a little bit of an open question under this administration, those aren't going to be going to Ukraine. Zelensky has commented on that. If you're someone who's super motivated around the idea of Taiwanese sovereignty or South, the North-South Korea dynamics, you should be very concerned as well, because the U.S. is taking away interceptors based in South Korea. We've seen North Korea respond with a statement to that effect. My hope is, so backing up a little bit, thinking about the ways that already the Gulf countries basically are furious about all of this. It's the biggest I told you so, which is what the Qatari spokesperson, Majid al-Ansari, said. Just basically, we told you not to do this, you idiot. But we had already seen Gulf countries in the past few years that had come to the correct conclusion that they couldn't really rely on the United States. And in particular, you think about things like the 2019 Iranian strike on the Abqaiq oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, when Trump just sort of shrugged and was like, well, it wasn't an American facility. And the Saudis were like, what? What do you mean? Like, I thought you said you were committed to our security. And so as a result, MBS moved to lower the temperature with Tehran, resulting eventually in the normalization of relations in March of 2023. When I was in Saudi Arabia in December speaking with officials at the foreign ministry, they were all on board with this idea that like Saudi Arabia needs to prioritize its own economic transition. We're headed to a post-oil future led by Chinese technological developments. And it's really not in our own national interest to get into these unnecessary fights with Iran. Like, you can't change geography. Iran is just there. We're just going to have a modus vivendi. And the whole, like, all the GCC countries had basically gotten to this point where they were not going to rely on the US to defend them from Iran. They just had concluded that it was best to take down the temperature and not get into a war or some sort of conflict. And so you think about how other countries around the world that have relied on the United States for their security are waking up to this fact as well. I mean, think about South Korea is probably saying to itself, wow, if we really can't rely on the United States to back us up, maybe we should also be, trying to find some kind of modus vivendi with North Korea. That the Europeans are waking up to the fact that, I mean, they're already aware of the fact that they couldn't count on the U.S. to defend them with Ukraine or in terms of Russia. So, I mean, my hope is in the long run. I mean, although the Middle East is being destroyed right now, so that is it's a very thin silver lining to sort of the scale of the destruction. But my hope is that the world will wake up to the fact that they should not rely on the United States. All it takes is a U.S. president like Trump to throw into question this entire world order that has relied so heavily on the United States playing this role of the security guarantor of the largest economy, that the dollar is the reserve currency. And so, I mean, Trump is just sort of driving American primacy into the ground, which, I mean, in the long run, I think may be better for the world. But the amount of destruction involved in getting there is horrifying.
So Donald Trump isn't the accelerationist we deserve, but he's the accelerationist we need.
Basically. I mean, and again, this is something we work on at the Quincy Institute, of thinking about, like, we have something called the Better Order Project, which is kind of like, how do you reform the UN Security Council? Like, how do you sort of like reshape the global order in such a way to reflect the increased power of countries in the global south, to reflect China's relative increase in importance and power, without kind of destroying the whole system, without torpedoing the UN. Because, I mean, this is the concern, is like, as the UN is increasingly shown to be so ineffective and complicit in, you think about things like Resolution 2803, which was the UN security resolution that rubber stamped the Board of Peace, which was wild. But that, like, without this sort of global system that everybody has to a certain extent bought into, and other countries continue to abide by international law, and it's just the United States and Israel that have been for so long just completely just don't give a damn about international law. But if that falls apart, there's nothing to replace it. Like we may just have this sort of fragmented, you might, and which I think could be much more inherently unstable, unfortunately, and could really be dangerous for the world.
Yeah. So what? I mean, you're working on this at the Quincy Institute. I mean, what is the plan? Because I have to. I mean, I have to confess. I mean, I've said it on the podcast a million times that I don't have a great deal of confidence. I mean, look, the argument is that the international law was always a fiction that was established to police the global South and turn the blind eye to the peccadillos of the North and their broader military financial interest in maintaining what we no longer call imperialism, but it is that in a different form. So, even the idea of reestablishing a project of international law, is it possible for it to be constructively different than what existed before if fundamentally the world has operated on a might makes right basis this whole time, and what we're looking for is just getting back to a veneer of consistency? And is that something ultimately that we want to do? Is there, again, something to this argument that maybe the only good thing you can say about Donald Trump is that he has exposed the world for what it is? And that's part of why you see so many people across the ideological spectrum upset with him, that the war in Iran is very unpopular, including among conservatives. I think I saw a poll that said that the only thing less popular than the war in Iran is the Democratic Party. I mean, at the Quincy Institute, how are you thinking of moving forward or reconstituting an international body, shoring up the UN, insulating it from the United States's political ambitions, given that it relies so heavily on the U.S. for funding, et cetera?
I just got back from a meeting of the Hague Group. This was a group that was launched in January of last year with 8 countries from the global South dedicated to try to hold Israel accountable for its violations of international law, specifically based on the 2024 ruling of the International Court of Justice that Palestinians indeed have a right to self-determination, and that all countries had a legal obligation to help them achieve that right and to hold Israel accountable for its illegal occupation. And on the one hand, I think, a lot of people have been expressing their frustration at the inability of international law to actually rein in the superpowers. And as you said, I certainly agree with the criticism that international law was largely just aimed at the basically the global South, and that the first time having, well, certainly Milosevic being tried by the International Criminal Court, and then Netanyahu being charged by the ICC, and I think it's important to keep in mind that while the system of international law that was set up in the aftermath of World War II very much reflected the power imbalance at the time, reflected those colonial legacies, the underlying idea that states should be governed by laws and should adhere to those laws is still valuable. I think it's important not to allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. I think a lot of those fundamental principles that were there are still ones that many peoples and countries around the world still agree with and still adhere to. I mean, this was what was so fascinating about the Hague Group so it started with 8. Then I was able to attend the emergency meeting in Bogota, where I believe it was 27 countries attended. Then at UNGA last year, I think it was 30 countries. And this time there were 40 countries, including 6 European countries. Countries like Spain and Sweden and Switzerland. I mean, these not to be sort of snobbish about countries that are less powerful, but indicating that also some of these middle powers, including China was in attendance, Turkey was in attendance, that countries around the world want international law and not some sort of like rules-based international order where it's like you only apply the law when it suits you. You yell about international law when Russia invades Ukraine, but not when Israel is genociding Palestinians in Gaza. But actually applying the law and equality under the law. And there are many, many people and even countries around the world who, by attending the Hague Group or otherwise participating in this, are reinforcing and reaffirming their commitment to those principles. And so while like it is also important to keep in mind that like the institutions set up after World War II were mostly designed to prevent World War III. And thus far, they have been successful in largely preventing war in Europe, not in the rest of the world. But they did kind of what the Europeans set them up to do. And so I think moving forward, this idea of needing to do things like reform the veto in the UN Security Council, with which most of the other permanent members are willing to countenance, to talk about that, except for the United States. Again, I mean, I think as America's relative power declines, I so hope that we will see kind of in this expressed desire for international law to actually be effective, that you'll see a recommitment to it. Is my I don't know that it'll happen, but that's my hope.
Yeah, I gotta say, I'm not trying to drag you into this. This is a version of an existential question that I've been asking again and again on the podcast, which is, you know, are we being sort of Pollyanna about having an expectation that there's any real accountability from people in power? Have people in power ever held themselves to be accountable? Has the desire for there to be international law and the desire among, you know, Spain and Switzerland and Turkey and some of these other countries really driven by sort of a moral commitment to establishing global standards and then meeting them, as opposed to an economic interest in knowing like the Strait of Hormuz. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. You know, it's gonna stay open. You know, are my shipping lanes gonna be intact? Am I gonna be able to do the business and the commerce and keep my economy afloat, so that my political interests are maintained the next election season? And I'm not saying that, you know, like at the end of the day, people benefit from those kinds of calculations all the time, but they're not anything I would hang my hat on. It's not what I would rely on, because if the financial interests go the other way, and there are a great deal of financial interests that are served by the war in Iran, for instance, and another resource war, as they all seem to be, then do I believe that there is going to be actually a better international law, or is there going to be a new kind of power vacuum and a rearrangement that happens as America slips off the top of the rung, and then we just have to, you know, we're just in another system that is driven by the same interests with just someone else at the top?
I mean, I think it's a lot of the reason other countries are interested in having an actual, you know, international law that works is that it's in their own self-interest. I mean, you think about kind of like in a society, you want the law to apply to everyone. Like, you know, like if I have to follow the law, others have to follow the law, and if they break it, they'll
but they don't.
Well,
but they don't. You know, wage theft is like the most under accounted for crime in the country, right? Like business owners, millionaires and billionaires never follow the law. They evade their taxes. They don't pay their workers. The Epstein files reveals that they might have been trafficking kids and killing people and doing all kinds of horrible things. And there's never any accountability for them. They won't release the names of the accused, you know, like, and we follow the law. We like to, you know, because we'll get in trouble if we don't. You know, and the idea that there's like all of this, I mean, of course, like I don't want to murder people, and I think that it's good to live in a society, and but I think that because I understand that if we don't have rules in a society, I don't have any way to protect myself. And very rich people or countries with nuclear bombs don't feel that way. They think they can, and they can in fact protect themselves, even if they don't hold themselves to the same standards, because again, might makes right.
But we still want to live in a system where the law would apply to everyone, right?
Well, sure, but there's this fundamental enforceability question. Absent enforceability, you know, we have a court system. Okay, the courts say, you know, you're going to go to jail. You committed the crime. We did the trial. You're guilty. None of it matters if there's not, you know, police officers who can put the cuffs on you and drag you to the cell. If there's not an institution that can forcibly, physically put put you behind bars. And that's, I don't mean to be so, pedantic about it, but like, none of it is anything. We're in the wild, wild west without a sheriff, without the person with the gun. And I do think there's an argument that left movements are being sort of naive when we talk about lobbying and, persuading, when ultimately there are all of these interests that are aligned behind the force of the military. It's not an accident that we have the largest military in the world. It's not an accident that we have these incredibly robust and growing policing institutions and cop cities and across the country, and that a movement like Defund the Police gets so much pushback in a bipartisan way because it seems obvious that power comes at the tip of the gun, And so what does that mean on an international level? As we try to, is the best we can hope for to sort of reestablish norms where we have like the guy with the gun is more benevolent than the United States and under Trump and under Biden and under a lot of other presidents have been. And is that possible given what the interests are?
I mean, I think just going back to sort of like the self-interest of a lot of countries is served by international law being upheld. And I think, the way the world is going, in particular with sort of China leading the energy transition and sort of, that American power was so tied to petroleum. And now with sort of solar power, wind power, like the US, Trump made sure we were not gonna be able to compete on those fronts. And so it's gonna be China. And I think, China is so interesting because it doesn't have this sort of fundamental, I mean, there's certainly ideas about, and I'm not a China expert, so excuse me for if I'm inaccurate or generalizing here, but there's not kind of this idea that everyone should do what China does the way America has, that like everybody should emulate American democracy and we have the best system and like everybody should look like us and we're going to export democracy, et cetera, et cetera. China's really not that interested in interfering in the domestic affairs of other countries. And, certainly in my experience at the State Department working on human rights, it was so embedded, even among colleagues who I otherwise view as fundamentally motivated by these questions of, human equality and, kind of progressive ideas around the need to kind of protect people. Like they were so on board with this idea that the United States is the guarantor of human rights and like we can't let, China, these other like countries that don't care about human rights, like this is why the US has to like remain the most powerful country in the world. And it's like, have you seen what we do? Like the amount of money we like, think about your piddling little project to like support civil society in Tunisia, where like, congratulations, democracy is dead because of us and just dynamics in the region. Versus like the billions of dollars the United States spends on army, whether it's security assistance or just weapon sales, building up the security apparatuses in this entire region, in the whole world. And so whereas, I mean, again, like China certainly has committed gross violations of human rights, as have many, many countries around the world, as has the United States. But I think it is fundamentally more stable to have a powerful, well, if it's going to be China, they are not going to interfere as much the way the United States has out of this like misguided sense of their own sort of moral superiority. At least not yet. Things could change.
Well, this is the argument. Some people on the left have been accused of all sorts of things for being like overly sanguine about China and yada yada yada. But like history is what it is, and it's difficult. There are all these quotes from like Chinese officials where they're asked about America's behavior, this, that, and the other, and they'll say things like China has existed for 3,000 years, before the United States was even a spark in anybody's imagination, and it'll exist after, and we don't care what America's doing. We don't care what America's saying. We're not involved. And there's something, at least historically, refreshing about not getting, Monroe Doctrine or Don Roe doctrines into oblivion, and having someone who seems to be leading by or gaining kind of global influence by building infrastructure projects, et cetera. And it's not to say that it's benevolent. I mean, China sees that in its own interests.
Right. This sort of enlightened self-interest. And I mean, in the long run, I think the nation state system is also pretty inherently unstable, that ties to ethno-nationalism. Like, this is kind of a bigger conversation around like the future of humanity and how we organize ourselves as in polities. And so, like, unfortunately, I would not be surprised, 100 years down the road, like whatever the time frame is, if you do have a Chinese-led world order where China does start to, operate in these more pernicious ways, because that's just sort of the nature of power. My hope would be that they wouldn't, but I think this is what you get when you have these very powerful countries. And so hopefully moving forward, you wouldn't necessarily have these countries that are so much more powerful that can destroy other societies. Like, if I were in charge and sort of had made the sort of resource and population balance just a lot more equal, so you wouldn't have a country like the United States able to do something like what we've seen the United States do, or obviously like colonialism. I mean, like, this, I think we're a little this is very broad and maybe not so interesting as a result, but in the long run, I think it will be a question around, like, well, I mean, to what extent does relying on the nation state system, lead to these catastrophic wars? Like, are we gonna? People have been asking, like, do we think the Iran war leads to World War III? And I'm like, not right now, not based on what I'm seeing. But
Really?
we could
Well,
get
why
there.
not? Because reassure me. Reassure me, because I'm like, I literally woke up today and got an ad for doomsday shopping. Like, what do you need in your Go kit? And whereas I might have like flipped by it in the past, I was like very like taking notes, like, okay, apparently I need to go to the pool section of the store and get these chlorine things that can desalinate. Yeah, go ahead.
We should all have like Go kits just for like climate catastrophe, which is, you think about like the LA fires. Like, we should all be prepared for something like that. But I mean, I think part of the reason I say this is because I think so many Americans are so confused about Iran, because there's been so much emphasis on this idea of Iran's nuclear program, that they're like, oh my gosh, are they going to use their nuclear weapons? And it's like, they don't have nuclear weapons. Like, for the 100th time, Israel has nuclear weapons.
But Israel
Iran does not. Yeah. And like, so that's part of why I think when people are like, oh my gosh, World War III, and it's like, well,
but if Israel were to use them,
well, if the U.S.
then what happens?
The concern is that, Hegseth might use a nuclear weapon on Iran. Well, Trump, but like the crazy people we have, because, they're talking about this as like a religious war and the return of the Messiah, and like the number of complaints that are coming through these, hotlines for U.S. troops that are like, I signed up to defend the Constitution, and it is very contrary to the First Amendment of the Constitution to say that this is a religious war, or that the United States is fighting on behalf of Christendom or something.
None of this is done on a whim. Having been in their boots, having been in their shoes, having been in their flight suits, I know we think about them with every decision that we make and every recommendation that we make to the President of the United States. Those recommendations are made prayerfully. And when I pray every day for them and for this mission, I pray simply for the biblical wisdom to see what is right and the courage to do it. It's going to take courage to follow through on this. There's going to be a lot of noise, and we pray for that, and we hope all of you do as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
It's like, it is wild that these are the people that we have in charge. And also, I mean, you think about like this project of Greater Israel, that we have the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, just being like, yeah, that would be fine if they just take over their neighbors. And we see them, what they're doing now to Lebanon, that is getting almost no attention, is horrifying. Like, a 700,000, if not more by now, up to like 1 million people displaced, thousands of casualties. And I get like Lebanon is an afterthought. Gaza is an afterthought, where, Israel has blocked the crossings, other than maybe, I think, Kerem Shalom, they allowed something through, but it's like they already weren't allowing enough in. So the extent to which we have just sort of like tipped into these like religious nationalist ideas around the US is like fighting this war to get Jesus to return, and bring about the second coming of Christ. Like it's so wild that our first point of criticism for so long about Iran or terrorists in the Middle East is that they're like religious ideologues. And it's just every accusation is a confession.
It really is, and it's affirming on some level to see it more transparent, despite the overwhelming control of the legacy media. You mentioned that these whistleblowers have been raising their head to talk about religious extremism in the military. You alluded to that famous Tucker Carlson, Mike Huckabee interview where Huckabee's like, they're entitled to all of it.
You've appealed to Genesis. Genesis 15 says it's Abram, it's pre-Abraham, it's Abram, receives from God the news that his descendants will inherit the land. And you tell me as the theologian if I'm getting this wrong, but from the Euphrates to the Nile. I think that's right. And that would include like basically the entire Middle East. That would be the Levant. So that would be Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. It would also be big parts of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. It would be,
I'm not sure it would go that far. I mean, it would be a big piece of land, but here's the point.
It would be a lot of places that are now countries.
But this particular area that we're talking about now, Israel, is a land that God gave through Abraham to a people that he chose. It was a people, a place, and a purpose. We can look at it that way. Christian Zionism, I want to go back because that's where we started on this.
I'm not going to let you off on this because you have said it 3 times that God gave this land to this people. And so it is entirely fair for me with respect to ask, what land are you talking about? Because I just read Genesis 15, as I have many times. Mm-hmm. And that land, I think it says, from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is, once again, basically the entire Middle East. So God gave that land to his people, the Jews, or he didn't. You're saying he did. What does that mean? Does Israel have the right to that land? Because you're appealing to Genesis.
Yeah.
You're saying that's the original deed.
It would be fine if they took it all.
The displacement in Lebanon, that you're right, it is being sort of not discussed as an afterthought, partly because the mainstream media is what it is, partly because we are genuinely overwhelmed by the amount of things that are happening. But it's worth noting that the number of people displaced is equivalent to something like 1/6 of the entire population, if you can imagine what those numbers would look like if that were happening in the United States. And I want to make sure before we go, we get to your article that you recently published in the New Republic titled "The Unbelievable Madness of Our War with Iran." You write, "Last year I warned about the possibility that Israel might drag the United States into a regional conflict. What's happening now is worse than I ever could have imagined." In what way? I mean, I can imagine, but in what way specifically has what has been going on for the last, almost 2 weeks now exceeded your expectations of how low we could go?
Well, so the New Republic reached out to me because I had published this piece with them in July of 2024. So Biden was still president. At that time, we had seen there had been an exchange of missiles between Iran and Israel in April of 2024, but it was still, it was choreographed and like designed mostly to be performative. And what I was writing about was this concern was that Israel was going to invade Lebanon and drag the United States in. And at that time, it seems almost quaint. Like Israel did invade Lebanon on October 1st of that year. And then there was a ceasefire declared around 8 weeks later, and that Israel just violated constantly. But it was, treated by the media as if there was a ceasefire. And yet instead, instead of the U.S., getting involved in sort of another sort of relatively small, Israel does this. They attack Palestinians in Gaza. They attack Lebanon. They attack Syria. Instead, we have the U.S. launching this war on Iran, which has, looks to cripple the global economy. Oil is down is significantly down because Trump is now going to release some huge amount from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is he can only really do once. Like,
yeah,
that is
hilarious.
not a
I'm sorry. I seem to
long-term.
recall, weren't Republicans big mad when, not to defend Biden or anything, but weren't they like super upset when Biden did this to bring oil prices down?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, yes, obviously. Um, so it is yeah. So what I talk about in that piece is everything is so much worse than sort of what I had imagined would be this sort of regional war scenario, because I didn't imagine that the U.S. would actually be dragged in. That Israel would that Netanyahu would convince Trump to attack Iran and throw the entire global economy and certainly the region into chaos. And you think about, again, like the lack of understanding of what this would entail, that Trump just like didn't fundamentally understand the geo, like that Iran can close effectively the Strait of Hormuz, that then you have the Gulf countries that are so pissed off and are like, not only are they pulling investments or likely to pull investments from these Trump properties, or like Jared Kushner's little investment scheme, or the billions of dollars they've invested in the American economy, but now they're going to very likely rethink their willingness to contribute to the reconstruction of Gaza, which, I mean, that by itself, I certainly agree with their concerns that they didn't want to rebuild Gaza just to have Israel destroy it again. And like, what kind of guarantee was there? There wasn't a guarantee that wasn't going to happen. So, like, again, this idea that you just rebuild
Well,
Gaza.
if Trump flips it into his own little mini Trump branded Vegas Strip, which has been the fever dream fantasy of these real estate ghouls since the beginning of this conflict. I think the idea was, well, we're not going to bomb our own. We're going to, if Gaza becomes our playground, then, it'll be safe if it's American and Trump branded. Of course, the Iranian retaliation against American interests, including these Western hotels in the region, seems to be a signal. Seems to be a signal that no, you can't colonize this part of the world and expect to do it at zero risk.
Exactly. Which, then kind of plays into this idea that like, well, the United States has to destroy Iran such that it cannot like threaten Israeli and American military hegemony in the region. And then also, the thought after that is, and then we have to go after Turkey, because, Turkey, and it's like, Turkey's in NATO, you guys. Like, I know I just said NATO has been fundamentally fractured, but like, it still does exist. And they have American weapons. So like, would the U.S. support Israel going after Turkey? I wouldn't be surprised under this president.
Wait, what would Israel's argument / incentive be to go after Turkey next?
A new Turkish threat is emerging. I want to be very clear. Turkey and Qatar have gained influence in Syria, are seeking influence elsewhere and everywhere throughout the region. And from here, I warn, Turkey is the new Iran. Erdogan is sophisticated, dangerous, and he seeks to encircle Israel. And while some senior Israelis were on Qatar's payroll, Qatar and Turkey are nourishing the Islamic Brotherhood monster that is growing and eventually might become as dangerous as the one created by Iran. Turkey and Qatar are gaining influence not only in Syria, but also in Gaza, through the front door, and everywhere, and trying to create a new choke ring. Turkey is trying to flip Saudi Arabia against us and establish a hostile Sunni axis with nuclear Pakistan.
Because Israel feels fundamentally threatened by any country that is militarily powerful anywhere near it. So like also the Saudis. And this is one thing, talking to Saudis when I was there, what they were like, sure, right now it's beyond imagination that Israel would attack Saudi Arabia, but they have willingly attacked everyone else. They attacked Qatar. Who's to say they wouldn't come after us next? Which is a big part of why the Saudis, their desire for what they say is civilian nuclear power, but also a nuclear weapon. It's not just about Iran. It's also about Israel. so and I mean, the Israelis would say things like, Erdogan is Islamist, and we can't trust him, like whatever. They would like dehumanize Turks the same way they dehumanized everybody else. And the Islamophobia weapon, the cudgel, that has been used to attack Iran for decades, would then be turned against Turkey or turned against Saudi Arabia very easily. I mean, you think about like the amount of Islamophobic garbage we've been hearing from members of Congress just in like the past few weeks alone. And I think this goes back to this fundamental failure to hold the Bush administration accountable for the lies that got us into the war on Iraq and the horrific Islamophobia that was mobilized and manipulated after 9/11. Like, there was never an effort to push back against that, to say, no, this is completely unacceptable, such that now you have members of Congress tweeting this garbage that it's like, if they'd said that about the Jewish community, they would have been.
You're talking about this Tennessee Republican Andy Ogles, who tweeted Muslims don't belong in America. Randy Fine, of course,
Randy Fine,
longtime offender.
Yeah, and just and I mean, not to keep jumping all around, but I just heard Peter Beinart talking about his concern for the ways in which he was talking about the Brian McGinnis video, the U.S. Marine who was dragged out of the Senate committee hearing so violently that they snapped his arm.
Yes.
And that he's shouting like no one wants to fight a war for Israel.
The inability to name that shows your exemptness as leaders. This is wrong. No. And nobody wants to fight for Israel. Just a reminder to all our Commandant, please stand up as a Marine and stand up for America. No one wants to fight for Israel.
And Peter Beinart's concern is himself as an American Jew saying American Jewish institutions should be doing everything possible to kind of distance this effort that they've made to
he got some flack for that one. People felt like Beinart was sort of centering the concern, what's going to happen to American Jews in the midst of all that's very actively happening.
And I think that's who he is. That's his. But
I take your point. It's not a good look. And frankly, as much as the ADL wants to spend their time talking about, who Zohran Mamdani is breaking fast with at Gracie Mansion, the reality is that there is actually right-wing anti-Semitism that has always been there and is thriving. Right. But that, of course, is not the concern. And it feels weird to ask. It does feel weird to ask the left that is preoccupied in an anti-war movement to be kind of hyper concerned or prioritize the possibility of growing anti-Semitism in the face of blatant Islamophobia that is in fact is the fuel that is enabling the genocides and attacks all over the world, attack on Iran and the spreading conflict all over the world. It doesn't. I mean, I don't think you can say it enough times. Nothing that is happening makes sense in anybody's brain. None of the rationale that you're seeing trotted out in defense of the killing of the 160 children at this girls' school, or what was another 40 kids killed in a school in Lebanon. None of the justifications that are getting trotted out make sense absent a system that enables you to discount those lives vis-a-vis the lives of people in the West or white people in Israel.
Exactly. No, 100%. I mean, I think just to strongman Beinart's piece, I mean, he has just long talked about the need for, that he wants to live in a society where everyone is equal. That's what he wants for Israel. That's what he wants for the United States, that we don't have this prioritization of Christianity or white people. Which I think is kind of the point, that when this anti-Muslim bigotry is accepted, it's not a far cry to anti-Jewish bigotry, to not that obviously racism is just such a pervasive issue around the world, but also especially in this country. There was another point I wanted to make about I think just like one other crucial, sorry to like jump around a little bit here, but like one crucial point I just wanted to make before I have to go is targeting the girls' school has been described, and including by my own colleague here at Quincy, as the Morgenthau doctrine, which is this idea. Well, it wasn't targeting girls' school. He was just saying that what the U.S. has adopted. He said Dan Kane said the U.S. has adopted the Morgenthau doctrine of like annihilating Iran's industrial capacity. And one of the things I argue in the New Republic piece is no, it's not the Morgenthau doctrine, because one of the first things we saw in the first hours of the war was the United States intentionally targeting that girls' school, which is not part of industrial capacity. The U.S. has adopted the Dehia doctrine, which is the Israeli doctrine of overwhelming and disproportionate force and destruction, of targeting, again, not only like civilian infrastructure, but schools and hospitals. I mean, things that don't contribute to the war effort, they just contribute to the ability of society to exist and to function. So what we've seen Israel doing to Gaza, Pete Hegseth seems eager to emulate in Iran. And it seems to be doing so under the assumption that if the U.S. had been more willing to go after civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the U.S. would have won those wars, which is nonsense, because part of why the Afghan population was, why the U.S. occupation and the puppet Afghan government fell apart immediately was because of the violence the U.S. occupation had perpetrated upon the population of Afghanistan, who decided they would rather survive under the extremely authoritarian rule of the Taliban than be killed by the ongoing U.S. occupation. And so it's, Hegseth has adopted this genocidal logic, apparently thinking that this is how you win wars. And it's like, no, that's just how you kill everyone, because that's what Israel wants is Palestinians to just not exist anymore.
I mean, that's the problem. I mean, like this is why people get so frustrated with liberal Zionism, right? Zionism doesn't exist. You don't get a Jewish state plopped down in the middle of an Arab population, a non-Jewish population, without killing everybody. Like, you don't get to have democracy just because the numbers are not there. Democracy, right. One man, one vote. Like, equal representation can't exist if you are a minority, and you made yourself a minority because you plopped yourself down in the middle of a region where people don't share your religious or ethnic subscriptions. So I think part of the frustration, I'm not saying that Peter Beinart specifically has done this, but part of the frustration with those who are seen to shore up the idea that a liberal Zionism can exist that will affirm the right of the existence of a state of Israel, when we all know that the point of the state of Israel is as a Jewish state. There is no such thing as constructively a democratic Israel, because then it defeats the purpose of Israel to everyone who cares about Israel, right? and believing that project is worthwhile and legitimate, that it is worth it to preserve a state of Israel at any cost, it means you're justifying the expulsion, apartheid, confinement, and mass murder of everyone who doesn't conform to your population goals.
Right.
There's just no getting around. Like, and the idea that is not like front and center of this conversation. I'm sorry, we're 2 years into this. When I look at the timeline of when you quit, to refresh my memory, Dr. Sheline, I was like, holy crap! Like, we were like 7 months in at that point, and it was very difficult to imagine that we would be sitting here 2.5 years later having these same conversations. It felt like we were making some kind of. I mean, we made a lot of public progress in terms of how this war is perceived, and we all know the stats that we've talked about, that more people are sympathetic to Palestinians than Israelis at this point. Nobody wants this war in Iran, blah 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 blah. But the fundamental truth is it doesn't matter, because we don't live in a democracy. and that is where my angst comes from. It's that, like, to the extent that we have a project, and your quitting was such an important signpost in telegraphing that the status quo is not okay and not sustainable and not something we should be putting our names behind, or that my firing reflected something about the realities of corporate media, and that people were increasingly waking up to it, and that Jon Stewart and and Jake Tapper and everyone who participates in ways big and small in this project are getting dragged through, through the internet streets. It doesn't matter. And so, and I know you have to go, but this kind of question as to whether or not the fact of America attacking Iran on behalf of Israel is reflective of, is the beginning of the end, or a part going to lead consequently to the end of America's role as a respected arbiter of the international world order, or if it's actually evidence of America having a last grasp at grabbing what it can because it knows it's already at the end. And what danger, what are the dangers? How afraid should we be if what we're seeing is an animal cornered or feeling its power slip away? And its willingness to go as far as, what does that say about how far America might be willing to go and how widely this conflict might spread if everyone sees this as a final looting of the store?
Certainly I think that's Israel's attitude, knowing that, right now as they're coming up on the end of the MOU and saying, they want to rethink that because they actually want to make it harder for Congress to exert any kind of oversight over the $3.8 billion the U.S. gives Israel every year. And that was before. We've given them,
Yeah. What was the estimated cost of the first 2 days of this conflict? It's like $2 billion a day, or
it's more.
It was like six billion in the first 2 days, or something.
Just on weapons. Not even counting the $1 billion, each radar that is hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion each, whenever Iran takes one out, so certainly I think Israel is operating under the assumption that they've got to grab whatever they can while they still can. I think that what we're seeing I don't think Trump has, I think Trump is just completely disconnected from reality as far as what he has unleashed, and the consequences of this. And Hegseth just has a wet dream about, the second coming of the Messiah or whatever. I don't think those in power right now in the United States are fully aware of how this is really the end, potentially the end of kind of the American moment. And again, it would take a very long time. It's not, Rome didn't fall apart, in a day. But
even if nukes get deployed, even if I don't expect you to, be an expert on the nuclear strategy, but are you telling me that if Israel or America launched a nuke, it goes unanswered by someone else with one?
I don't think that Russia or China would fire a nuclear weapon at the United States to defend Israel, because then you do have mutual assured destruction. I think you may have.
Sorry to interrupt.
Because their interest just, that they're not going to sacrifice.
They're not
themselves.
As crazy as we are. They're not as crazy and stupid as we are, and Israel is.
Exactly. So, I think that it's more likely that the United States would use a tactical nuclear, just use a nuclear weapon on Iran. I think then Israel would, because I think Israel would want the okay from the United States. But again, I don't think China or Russia would then respond to defend Iran, because it wouldn't be aimed at them. I think if the U.S. were aiming nukes at Russia or China, then yeah, they would respond. But yeah, again,
it's true. We believe that America / Israel could detonate a nuclear bomb in Tehran, one of the most densely populated urban. I'm not saying it would be necessarily there, but a country of 100 million people, and it would go completely unanswered, and we can act with that level of impunity.
I unfortunately, yes, because I don't think we would see Russia or China respond with a nuclear weapon. I don't think you would see Pakistan or India responding, firing back. And the other, other nuclear armed powers in Europe also wouldn't. So yeah, but I do think it would then, the response would be that you have a nuclear arms race all over the world. that every country would see the imperative of having nuclear weapons. I do have to go, unfortunately, but
sorry, I know you're past your time. You've been so generous with your time, Dr. Sheline. People can find your latest piece at the New Republic. Where else can they find you on the internet and beyond?
So on Twitter, I'm at Annelle Sheline, also Instagram at Annelle Sheline, on the Quincy Institute page, and I really appreciate everything you've been doing to continue to draw attention to Palestine, to Israel's genocide of Palestinians, and possibly now, the possibility of genocidal actions against Iran as well.
I appreciate you and the enormous amount of courage that you have shown over this last 2.5 years. I don't think it can be said enough. There is no reward for doing the right thing in life. If anything, it's just rounds of punishment. And the people who do so, especially without the safety net that the affluent have and never take advantage of, it seems, I think are incredibly and deserve all of the praise in the world, because that's all you're getting. You're not getting anything out of it than a place in heaven, if it exists, and kind of like an internal understanding that you can live with yourself and the respect of your peers.
I think that's big, being able to look yourself in the mirror and to be able to explain to my daughter, years down the road, that I tried to do what I could.
Well, she's a very lucky girl, and we're very lucky to have been able to spend the last hour or so with you. Thank you again, Dr. Sheline.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you who tuned into this episode of Bad Faith. You can get an extra episode every Monday by subscribing at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. As always, take care of yourselves and try to remember to keep the faith.
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.